This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
6 months to the day since Netanyahu returned to office, and reality, like in a time lapse, seems to move much, much faster. The events of this week, no different. A lot to go through, and we will try to make sense of it all. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet podcasts. I have to say, it's been a little bit of a challenge for me to focus on the news this week because I have been engaged, unusually for me, some might say, in devoting serious amounts of time to sporting activities. Not playing, I hasten to add, but instead watching. Nevertheless, the unholy duties never rest and never sleep. And so even when I was watching the sport, I was thinking, this is going to make a great item for Unholy.
You keep saying the sport. Can we talk about this for a minute before we dive into so much news going on?
Yeah, we can. I was at Lord's Cricket Ground, which, as every listener will know, is the home of cricket for the greatest sporting rivalry that exists, namely England versus Australia, the Ashes, as the storied series is known. And I was thinking, wow, this is bad in a way because I'm off duty, this should be unholy, when I got a message telling me that I must attend and visit the museum there because there is a display on cricket and Jews. And sure enough, there is. If you go to Lord's Cricket Ground, you don't have to have a ticket for the game. You can wait till after the match. Just go to Lord's Cricket Ground. You can go to the museum, and there's a display there of items of significance to cricket and Jews. There are the batting pads, the sort of protective equipment a cricketer wears that belong to playwright Harold Pinter, a great Jewish enthusiast for the game. And then this kills me. Mandy Yachad, South African international player of some stature, wore tzitzit, ritual prayer garment, when playing the game. They are in a glass case for your display. And then this is the thing that I'm going to just tell you because I think you'll love this. While at the game, a message arrived, forwarded on WhatsApp saying, "Good morning, Minyan confirmed to start 5 minutes after the tea interval begins. Meet in the multi-faith room to daven Mincha and Mariv." I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. The point is, Jews and cricket, I've often said it's particularly Orthodox Jews who love cricket. And I've said this without really much of a sort of data set, if I'm honest. But the rules, there are so many rules to the game of cricket, often very arcane. And they remind me, as a cricket fan, of the rules of kashrut, the dietary laws defining what's kosher and what isn't. There are always exceptions. There are these bizarre, arcane little details. No wonder Orthodox Jews love cricket. It's basically sort of kashrut on a field. It's a good, joyous game. England did not play so brilliantly the day I was there, but the point is, my intuition that cricket is a very fundamentally Jewish game, confirmed by my visit to Lord's, and listen to that name, even invoking the Almighty, confirmed by my visit to Lord's, the great Jewish museum there, and look, there are even prayers at the appropriate time if you go.
Okay, so I just want to say, firstly, you are so English, Johnny Friedland. It's really, we can't escape that fact. If someone wanted to deny it or try, that's first. But first of all, a very elegant sport, you must say. I always had this feeling like Jewish mothers would agree for their sons to play cricket because they can't really get hurt that much, right? What was Bill Bryson's line about cricket, that the spectators burn more calories than people actually playing? So yeah, one day you'll take me to Lord's to see, but I have to tell you there's also an Israeli Cricket Association. Just if you were wondering, fun fact, I think Gerald Kessel, who was once the CNN correspondent in Jerusalem, captained that team at some point. So lots of stuff. I'm very glad we took this scenic route to the beginning of our program.
And I have actually, it is nearly 40 years ago, I have actually seen the Israel national cricket team.
Are we any good?
play.
Are we any good? Because I definitely didn't.
I'm not so sure. Maybe there's been improvement in the 40 years that have passed. But no.
You don't have to say the truth. Tell the truth all the time is what I'm saying.
Always. That's the rule on Unholy. You're right. That was the scenic route. Meanwhile, the news has not stopped at all.
No, it never seems to stop, for sure. So let's begin with what is happening in Israel and particularly in the West Bank after the terror attack in Eli last Wednesday. 4 Israelis were murdered next to the settlement. What we've been seeing really is rampages, string of settler attacks against Palestinian villages, burning homes, towns in revenge of the terror attack. And on Saturday evening, these events led to a very rare occasion in which the 3 chiefs, heads of the security branches in Israel, basically published a joint statement. It's the IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, the Shin Bet head Ronen Bar, and the police commissioner Kobi Shabtai. And this is what they said. It reads as follows. I think it's important to kind of read it word for word. In recent days, violent attacks have been carried out by Israelis in Judea and Samaria against innocent Palestinians, they write. These attacks contradict every moral and Jewish value. They constitute in every way nationalist terrorism, and we are obliged to fight them. Now, this is what came out, and parts of the Netanyahu government, the more, let's say, far-right parts of his government, particularly Orit Struk from Religious Zionism, was very, very upset that the head of the Israeli branches dared, in her eyes, to call this terrorism. And she said, who are they to preach us? Who are they to put out this announcement under our noses? Are they the Wagner group? That is what she called them, basically comparing the head of security branches in Israel to mercenaries trying to overthrow Putin.
Which is shocking language in itself. I mean, again, we've talked last week in our Chutzpah award, or the other day anyway, of one of the religious, ultra-religious parties daring to criticize those who don't serve, as if unaware that the ultra-Orthodox themselves do not serve. I know Orit Struk is not from that universe, but nevertheless, for settlers who have relied often for their day-to-day security and protection on the IDF, to then call these people mercenaries when they are very often risking young people, 18, 19 years old, conscripts, risking their lives so that some of these people can live in these very far-out settlements in very provocative locations. It seems to me, illegal settlements, I would say. It seems to me, well, it's beyond chutzpah. It's an outrageous thing for her to have said.
And of course, a few hours after she said what she said, IDF Brigadier Commander in the Northwest Bank, Colonel Eliav Elbaz, was verbally attacked by extreme settlers while visiting a family of one of those Israelis murdered at Eli. They called him a traitor and a murderer. And then what we saw is the IDF Chief of Staff actually having to say yesterday at a graduation ceremony, whoever berated the IDF should remember that even an apology cannot cancel the damage done. Now, look, we have to say this. Even in unpredictable Israel, unscripted Israel, all of what I've described is highly irregular. It is highly irregular for the heads of the branches, security branches, to put out this kind of statement. It's highly irregular for a minister to talk against them in such a way. And it's pretty highly irregular for settlers, even if they're very upset, to yell at top military brass. And of course, for the IDF Chief of Staff to actually single out a minister and say, you shouldn't have said that. All of this just sort of illustrating how high tensions are on ground.
Yeah, I was really struck by that address from the IDF Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi. I thought that those comments rebuking the right were one thing, but also saying that any officer who stands by as a citizen of Israel, while a citizen of Israel torches a home of a Palestinian, cannot be an officer. That they are unfit to serve if people stand by and allow these sorts of attacks to go on. Any officer who sees an Israeli citizen intending to throw a Molotov cocktail at a Palestinian house and stands idly by cannot be an officer. And you remember, I remember the IDF commander on the ground saying that attack, again, by Jewish settlers on the Palestinian community of Huwara were engaged in a pogrom. This is Well, it recalls to me some of the conversation that was going on, including on this podcast, early on when the street protests about the judicial overhaul, which we'll come to, were going on, saying, civil war, is that plausible? Is it possible in this country? And, the president himself warning, saying anyone who thinks civil war is not a possibility is not paying attention. Mm-hmm. When you have the military branch talking like this to their citizens, fellow citizens, at least to me, it conjured up that image. And in a way, Orit Struk invoking the Wagner Group is sort of pressing the same button.
Yeah. And all this is going on. You mentioned this, right? The military is protecting Israeli citizens and all this is going on. Well, there's still Palestinian terror. And the heads of security branches are saying to the settler leaders, we can't protect you. If you have these youngsters going every evening into Palestinian villages, something terrible might happen and you have to notice this. So this is what is happening in that regard. But of course, everything else is also in turmoil. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, we've been talking about this for many weeks now, of course, the judicial overhaul and this feeling that we had like the coalition is freezing it or freezing parts of it. And now it is back on the table. Prime Minister Netanyahu saying quite clearly to the Wall Street Journal in an interview, he's saying, look, I'm throwing out, I think were his exact words, the override clause. That, Netanyahu says, is off the table.
Right after the original proposal was put forward, I said that the idea of an override clause where the parliament, the Knesset, can override the decisions of the Supreme Court with a simple majority, I threw that out. It's out. And I think it's very clear that the way of choosing judges, it's not going to be the current structure, but it's not going to be the original structure.
By the way, he sort of already said this in Hebrew, but this is, let's say there are parts of the coalition that are very upset at this and saying that this is backtracking and in some way sending a white flag to the opposition. But besides that, we should say that this coalition is going to push forward what we have been talking about, the reasonableness clause. That will probably see itself getting approved by the end of this Knesset session, which is the end of July.
And that alone is significant. It's, he will want to say, and I think it's very significant that he gave the interview to the Wall Street Journal. I think he wants a message to go out to the international community. Yeah, don't worry, guys. I dropped all that horrible stuff that had you comparing me to Viktor Orban. That's all gone. Now we're into just a few procedural things. Don't worry. But if that business of the reasonable clause, if the move on that remains in place, in other words, removing the Supreme Court's ability to strike down those decisions it regards as unreasonable, well, then that power grab has still happened. But I think it does look to me like a move to get that, sort of get that past international opinion. Talking of which, by the way, I should have mentioned that all this stuff we talked about earlier going on is being noticed internationally. It's not as if what goes on in Israel stays in Israel, if you like. And this week, I thought significant, the Financial Times newspaper, which is, cannot be faulted as just another, predictable critic of Israel, always was, etc. It can't be said of that. And a paper with serious international influence in its editorial called on Western countries to at least increase the possibility or the threat, depending on how you see it, of taking action against settler violence in the West Bank, Jewish settler violence in the West Bank, including with the threat of a boycott of products made in the settlements. It wrote, given the gravity of what is happening, Washington and European capitals should take a tougher line. That means threatening to ban imports of goods produced in the settlements. This is a perennial issue, the notion of boycotts and, boycott of Israel itself, BDS so-called, but very specifically ones targeted. And to see a newspaper like the FT raise this because they have noticed the violence going on, just I think is an indicator that this stuff is not going by unremarked. People are, exaggerations say the world is watching, but people who think about these things are noticing.
Yes, well, the world is watching the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, and the world is also watching very closely what Netanyahu is doing with the judicial overhaul. And we talked about the reasonableness clause, which is important, right? That doctrine that says that the Supreme Court, the common law in Israel, the Supreme Court can override a decision that is extremely unreasonable. For example, we saw this only a few months ago, the decision to make recurring tax offender a minister again, Aryeh Deri, and the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, saying basically this is unreasonable. Now, Shlomo Kari, who's the Minister of Communication, kind of let the cat out of the bag yesterday in an interview with Channel 12. He said, look, I think we should fire the Attorney General in Israel, but we can't do that as long as the reasonableness clause is still intact. We should remind maybe our listeners that the Attorney General is both the chief prosecutor in Israel and an advisor to the government, Gali Ba'arav Miara, which means if you actually fire her, which a lot of people in the coalition think you should do, while Netanyahu is still on trial, if anyone can convince someone that that's reasonable, if they fire her, then you can open up the trial, you can do all kinds of things. And Netanyahu was very quick to say, no, I have nothing to do with that, it's not my suggestion, but you understand why the reasonableness clause is such an important issue. And again, it begs the question, why is Netanyahu returning to this legislation? You know, we saw the protests, we saw the pressure from Washington. Why return to this? I think the answer is, first, that he thinks that he can convince the protesters that it's not a big deal, right? That it's reasonable for him to think that the reasonableness clause is not huge. Do you see what I did there, right? But also...
I did, but in a way, they're the same move that he's trying to pull internationally.
Right.
So just saying it's technical and procedural.
Right. It's the same thing, right? I'm trying to say, no, it's just it's a minute thing. I had a huge plan. I'm just passing this and maybe something about the appointments judicial committee, but that's it, right? And the rest I'm throwing away, as he said. But so it's that, and it's also that we have figured out in these 6 months that Yariv Levin and his supporters, whether they be in the Likud or religious Zionism, all think that this should be reformed, that the judiciary should be, some would say, weakened. They're stronger than we thought, and that many Israelis thought. And he is very wary of what he can do and what he can't do. He is stuck between, again, a rock and a hard place or a hard and a harder place.
Yes, I mean, I think that temptation to think of them as a sort of fringe, and that he only really had pressure from one direction, the anti-reform direction, was mistaken. And as you say, there is pressure the other way too. I wondered and sort of thought for a moment that where you might have been going with that in saying, why does he persist in doing this, was related perhaps to the point you're making about the Attorney General and the fact that he has his own case, and that therefore that if the unreasonable clause bit is struck down, that would allow the appointment of people who have had convictions or trouble with the law, yes, as ministers, but maybe even as prime minister, and therefore does he, I mean, questioned, is part of the point on this business, this very specific point about reasonableness clause, that he has skin in that game, given that he has, as it were, business before the courts in the notion that he is himself on trial. Yeah. Could that be part of it?
Yes, many would say that the issue here is that indeed, since he is on trial these days, we will talk about his trial in a few minutes, that is a very problematic thing to do and can be by the courts directed as being extreme unreasonableness for him to go anywhere near firing the Attorney General. So this is all very, very very careful sort of wording here that we should notice.
So we're talking about this case of his, and rather dramatically, it moved to Britain this week with a courtroom scene played out, not in London, actually, in the seaside town of Brighton, where the film mogul and supposed very deep and close friend of Netanyahu, Arnon Milchan, testified in that trial from a courtroom in Brighton. He had told the court that he was too ill to travel to Israel itself. He couldn't appear in London because it was said there was a better venue in Brighton, better in terms of guaranteeing security and so on, and that he would provide testimony there remotely from that closed court. I mean, the drama of it was twofold. First, protesters outside, there's some video in circulating of showing the protesters outside there and present to barrack and sort of hassle Sarah Netanyahu, and that's the second part of the drama. She had flown in to be present in the courtroom. The defense team said she was there to help jog the memory of the witness, just in case he was a little rusty on the details. Helpfully and kindly, Sarah Netanyahu was present to just fill in the odd gaps in the memory that might appear. Those people, and of course I make no connection here at all, but those people who are steeped in Hollywood courtroom dramas will remember that one of the great devices of those wholly fictional stories is that the witness who is about to testify against, say, and this happens in one film, the mafia kingpin, the witness is about to spill the beans, and just seconds before they take the stand, an associate of said mafia kingpin comes into the courtroom and doesn't need to do or say anything, but just by being there has the power to intimidate the witness. As I say, I make no connection at all between that and events in Brighton, but there is a famous Hollywood trope on those lines. As it turned out, I think Milchan, his testimony about the business of giving gifts to Netanyahu in return for favours was, observers noted, milder and diluted somewhat from the testimony he had given earlier on record to the police. And whether or not that was due to the presence of a certain well-known spouse in the courtroom, of course, one can only guess. But high drama, and especially with those protesters chanting the now trademark phrase or chant of "Busha," shame, to Sarah Netanyahu as she went in and out of this venue, which actually wasn't a courtroom; it was just a sort of venue that had been used for this process.
Yes. Well, first of all, we need to say that this case against Netanyahu is 1 out of 3. It's case 1000. As you say, Netanyahu receiving gifts from Hollywood mogul Arnon Milchan in return for political favors. So the charges against Netanyahu are fraud and breach of trust. I would say that the defense has a bit of an issue here, a bit of a problem, because if you're saying, and what they're trying to say, right, is that Milchan and Netanyahu were intensely close friends, and that is why Sarah Netanyahu is there too, right? Kissing him on the cheek before his testimony starts to illustrate to everyone that they're indeed very good friends. So, what's a little bit of champagne and maybe some jewelry and cigars between friends? What's the big deal? But if that is the case, and they are indeed very, very good friends, then Netanyahu shouldn't have been anywhere near helping Milchan out in things like what has been dubbed the Milchan Law, which is tax exemption for Israelis returning to Israel, and other things. So it's still a problematic case for Netanyahu, even if, as you mentioned, Milchan sounded a little more reluctant in his testimony than he did in front of police investigators. Netanyahu got some good news this week in another case against him, case 4000, in which the judges in the District Court of Jerusalem suggested the prosecution withdraw the bribery charges in that case against Netanyahu. It doesn't say anything about the charges of fraud and breach of trust, but it was very good news for Netanyahu. All this leads me just to point out to you on the calendar, Jonathan, that in something between February and May, defendant number 1, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, will have to step up and begin his testimony in front of the court. That can take about 3 weeks. There's a lot of speculation in the political circles. He wouldn't want to get to that situation. He wouldn't want to testify. And that's where a lot of people are actually talking, again, about the issue of plea bargaining.
And just why give us the reasoning of the judges who said that bribery charge should be pulled? What was their argument for that? It
looks like what they are saying. Again, they suggested that the prosecution withdraw that specific charge. Again, there's also the charge of fraud and breach of trust. It was always a very complicated case, or probably the most complicated charge to prove, the charge of bribery, because what you're actually saying here is that the bribe, or what he received in return, is favorable coverage. And so maybe it seems like, and again, they didn't give their reasoning, this was a closed discussion that was leaked, so they didn't give their reasoning. It's highly irregular, but it looks like they weren't convinced that it can lead to a conviction in bribery. They didn't say anything about the rest of the charges.
So there's that prospect for him looming in 2024. I mean, the diary is getting pretty crammed for 2024. I mean, there's a UK election, but much more significantly for Israel, an American presidential election. That's the last thing he's going to want to be doing in 2024.
Right. It's the last thing he'd want to do. The first thing maybe, or one of the first things he'd want to do is to meet President Biden. And that invite has yet to arrive. By the way, the president of the state of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, will be in the White House July 18th, if I'm not mistaken. Now, when you look at what Netanyahu is doing, we should add into the mix the fact that his office said this week that Netanyahu would soon visit China. Now, this all begs the question, right? If you want to get an invite from the White House and look at what you are doing, one, you are advancing the judicial legislation, which you know upsets Washington, right? I mean, the White House has said this more than once. You're pushing forward construction of settlements. It doesn't seem to be pushing back against settler violence. And on top of all that, you're now talking about going to China, not the U.S.'s best friend. So what is happening here? I mean, I would always say that it's important in life to look at children because children are very intelligent. The way they behave is interesting. You can go one out of two ways if you want to get your parents' attention. You can get the positive attention, be the good kid, do your homework, clean your room, etc. Or you can get the negative attention. It's still attention, right? If you, for example, mess up your room, expand into other rooms and make them messy as well. I don't know where these examples come from. But that is, I think, some of what Netanyahu is trying to do. He's always someone who liked having leverage. And this leverage is saying, look, I have friends in other places in the world. Now, look what you can do for me.
Yeah, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil, and he is, I think you're right, he's realizing, okay, I might as well be the squeaky wheel here and be a problem for this White House where they'll think, what are we going to do? That day, July 18th, with the visit of President Herzog, that's going to be absolutely a dagger in the heart for Netanyahu. He won't be able to bear those pictures of Herzog there ahead of him in receiving that invitation. I mentioned, I think on a previous episode, I do think there is political benefit to being America's best buddy. I mean, domestic political benefit. Mm. And if you can't have that, well, then there's domestic political reward in being the guy who stands up to the Israel-hating Democrats, in the mental universe of the Israeli right. There's no reward in being nothing, in being sort of vanilla. Or even, in fact, being a doormat who Biden can just walk over and repeatedly insult by refusing to invite. So if you're not going to get the invitation, at least get credit with your right-wing base for poking a finger in the eye of Joe Biden. And so I think there's also that. It's about getting American attention, but I also think there's a domestic political reward he'll be hoping for by playing tough with the Americans.
Right. I'm gonna ignore the fact that you dissed vanilla for some reason, but I will say that look at what he's doing internally. Right. He approved more than 1,000 units in the West Bank. The procedures for advancing new construction have been accelerated. The authority of all this has been given to Bezalel Smotrich. None of this is making Washington happy, but it is making Bezalel Smotrich happy, and that is good enough for the stability of the coalition at this junction.
Yeah, and let's face it, he needs that coalition to be stable because he'll be taking one look at those opinion polls and knows that, elections are not good news for him because he and his governing partners would do badly. Look, his international relations, it does not end just with the dynamic with the United States, as there's other things. I thought the Wall Street Journal interview was interesting for what it also included about Ukraine, comments from Netanyahu on that. The last weekend, the world was watching this Wagner attempted coup with Prigozhin, his attempt to march on Moscow, as it were. And I had conversations after that with, 2 or 3 different sort of with policymakers, either current or former. And the conversation got on to this Israel's sort of tightrope walk on Russia and Ukraine. And the sense that this can't hold forever, that the moment is coming where Israel's position of trying to sort of walk this balancing act between the two will run out. We've talked before on the podcast that, why Israel has to do it, that on the one hand, it needs to stay friendly with Moscow because of Russia's role in Syria and the granting of a free hand to Israel in doing what needs and wants to do in Syria. But international pressure with Putin looking weaker, weakened by the, in some ways, humiliating coup against him and his failure to severely punish those who perpetrated it. I don't know. I think Israel is in some kind of a dilemma with Ukraine. It's been one of the countries that has found it hardest to know how to handle that situation.
Yeah, and look, you look at what Netanyahu is saying to the Wall Street Journal. He's saying, we have concerns I don't think any of our Western allies, the Western allies of Ukraine has. He, of course, talks, and you mentioned this, the freedom of action Israel needs in Syria. And he also says that he's concerned that Israel weaponry can be captured in the Ukrainian battlefield and turned over to Iran, which is very interesting. Because on one hand, it's like we need to play nice with Russia on the Syrian border, but we don't want the whole relationship with Iran and Russia to grow warmer and some of the weaponry can fall. I think some people think that's not the greatest
reach.
Exactly. It's an overreach to say. It's a reach to say that an Iron Dome system can fall into the hands of Iran if Ukraine loses the war. But this is what he is trying to say to the international community.
All this going on, we've talked a lot about Israel, and yet it's funny, Jews in Europe, and I suspect actually in the United States and in other places, the story that may have chilled them most from the week would be nothing to do with Israel, very far away indeed. In fact, a kind of local election story, which normally people would not be paying attention to, I think is the one that may have had a few people feeling anxious. And that is an election of the far-right Alternative for Deutschland party in a district council election in Germany, that party winning at that level for the first time in what several commentators have said is a watershed moment in the country's politics. It happened in the east of Germany. I think people know that the AfD have done particularly well in the formerly communist part of the country, one of those sort of superficially paradoxical states of affairs, but when you think about it, perhaps not that paradoxical. The eastern town of Sonneberg in Thuringia elected a politician from the AfD to the equivalent post of mayor with by a big margin, 52.8% of the vote, beating handsomely the Christian Democrat candidate. The reason why this got a lot of attention is that the AfD party anyway has been associated with the far right, and you just have to write the words far right in the same sentence as Germany to have people in general, and I would say Jews, feeling edgy. But it's the particular politics of this wing of the party in Thuringia, which has been watched by the intelligence services in the country and is thought to be part of the right of the right, the far-right wing of the AfD, the Volkisch wing, which, again, you don't need to be a fluent German speaker to know why that has a troubling echo. That wing has officially been disbanded, but it's been long believed to sort of still exist under the radar or under the surface, as you like. And the fear is that just the symbolism of winning an election, holding an office, a kind of mayoral office, will give the AfD a kind of legitimacy and a kind of platform for it to push further in future contests, particularly in that eastern part of the country. There are parliamentary elections at regional level coming up next year. And so you have that warning, you have that process again that we're very familiar with, where liberal parties and all the mainstream ones, Social Democrats on the left, CDU on the right, all kinds of civil society organizations warning that defenders of democracy need to unite. I say familiar because it's that same dynamic you had a bit in France when a Le Pen is on the ballot paper and suddenly all the mainstream parties of left or right say, okay, we've got to put aside our own party differences and unite to fight democracy. And the main Jewish group in the country, the Central Council of Jews in Germany, said it was devastated by this result. They didn't want to criticize everyone who voted for it, but they said the party's candidate they have elected is, according to intelligence, a right-wing extremist. This is the bursting of a dam which the political powers in this country cannot just sort of brush off. So, some anxiety there whenever Germany, which we should also say is in many ways the most liberal country in Europe and the country that has done most to reckon with and look in the face the events of the Second World War with greater candor.
It has also done most to perpetrate them, so that kind of works.
That's right, and but people will get worried
when
this kind of thing is going on.
It sends shivers down your spine, doesn't it? I mean, in this polls, 1 out of 5 Germans say they will vote for this party. It's frightening. It really is, and not only for German Jews. I think it's incredibly frightening.
Yeah. We should hand out some awards, I think.
Tradition is tradition, my friend.
We are all about tradition. I will kick things off with a Mensch Award to the French woman who is set to become her country's first Orthodox female rabbi. Now, people who are not steeped in the sort of internals of the Jewish world may not know that, yes, there are rabbis and women rabbis, and there have been for a long time, but they tend to be in the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, Reform Judaism and the like, have had women rabbis for decades. The Orthodox world, in some ways, is almost defined by the fact that it's very closely sticks to the rule that says rabbis have to be men. And that's been sort of iron in Israel and beyond. But after graduating from an American rabbinical program this very month, Miriam Ackerman Sommer, age 26, has been running one of Paris's only modern Orthodox congregations, along with her husband. He also has gained his rabbinical degree this month. And so she went to this school, Yeshivat Maharat, which has this program for women to qualify, in effect, as a rabbi able to serve in Orthodox spaces. This will be a big deal. France still has one of the biggest Jewish communities outside Israel or America, home to some 450,000 Jews. And to see a woman who identifies as Orthodox lead a congregation is a big deal. It's my view that in the next 3 or 4 decades, this dam is going to burst in the wider Orthodox world, and that mainstream Orthodox congregations will see women rabbis, and you'll see only the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, stand aside. That's one of my evidence-free predictions for many decades to come, but I feel that's coming, and this is another sign in that direction.
I make predictions, it's things that will happen in 2 months. You make predictions, it's in decades. How do we ever know that it's going to come true?
That's why I made the predictions. You've rumbled me.
So, it falls to me, surprise, surprise, to give the Chutzpah Award, and we are giving it to the Israeli Knesset. We may have mentioned them once or twice in this program today, but specifically because of what happened yesterday in the Knesset plenum, member of Knesset, Sharren Haskel, she's from the National Unity Party, that's Benny Gantz's party. She was trying to present a bill, but she did it with her young daughter. She's 11 months old, Gabriel, and she was in a sling, sort of a baby carrier, and she wanted to step up and she started talking, but the Speaker of the House and his substitute said to her, listen, according to the rules of the Knesset, you can't stand up here with a person who isn't a member of Knesset, so you can't actually do this. She was really insulted. She said, listen, we can't be a place that sort of wants to show women how to, integrate their life and their career and their motherhood and not allow me to speak. I mean, obviously it's my baby. I can't leave her alone. She'll start crying and let me just go through this, but she wasn't allowed to. I think that's just a little bit strange. And, I think we can give them the Chutzpah Award of the week.
I think we can, and there's an interesting symmetry or asymmetry between our two award recipients this week, and it's just a story of women's progress in the Jewish world is very often one step forward, one step back. So an advance in France balanced out, or in some ways, offset, you pessimistically would think, by a step back in Israel, but both ongoing.
what you were trying to say is you made our listeners happy, and I came out with my party pooping story and ruined the mood a little bit. That was the balancing act you were actually referring to.
Well, I was thinking that it's like we could turn this into diaspora versus Israel rivalry, but notch one up for the diaspora, for the wider Jewish world this week. But often. These awards will go in the reverse direction. If you have enjoyed Unholy this week, please do spread the word. I was glad to say I was at an event this week where many people came up to me and said how much they love listening to Unholy. But a special shout out to the woman who came up to me and said, and I do spread the word. I do, I promise you. Just so like you say every week, I always tell friends and others to listen to it. So obviously the message is getting through. I've been repeating it often. But thank you to all of you who are indeed spreading the word.
We will say our thank yous to Gaia Glazer, Rom Atik, Snir Yamin, and Yair Bashan. And we will meet next week.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.